In 1941, Japanese commanders ruled the Pacific with unmatched naval power. Their aircraft carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, had crushed fleets, destroyed bases, and brought empires to their knees. But just 3 years later, those same commanders would stare at the horizon in stunned silence. Because the United States, the nation they once mocked as soft and unprepared, had unleashed an armada unlike anything the world had ever seen. By 1945, the Pacific wasn't an ocean anymore. It was an American runway, and the Japanese couldn't believe what they were seeing. In late 1941, Japan stood at the height of its power. The Imperial Navy had 6 of the most advanced aircraft carriers in existence: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. Together, they formed the Kido Butai, the most powerful carrier strike force in the world. Its planes flew farther, its crews trained harder, and its commanders thought in ways the old naval empires hadn't yet imagined. Their first great strike, Pearl Harbor. It wasn't just a surprise attack. It was the dawn of a new kind of warfare. For centuries, fleets had relied on battleships, heavy giants armed with massive guns. But at Pearl Harbor, Japan proved that air power could sink even the most heavily armored dreadnought. America's Pacific Fleet was left smoldering. The Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, gone. The rest, crippled or trapped in shallow water. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant architect of the attack, knew it was a gamble. But he believed it would buy Japan 6 months of free reign in the Pacific. 6 months to expand. 6 months to fortify. 6 months before America could fight back. And so, Japan moved quickly. Within weeks, their carriers swept across the Pacific. From the Philippines to Malaya, from Wake Island to Singapore. Everywhere they went, their Zero fighters dominated the skies. By mid-1942, the Japanese Navy controlled an empire stretching from Burma to the Solomons, and in Tokyo, the commanders of the Imperial General Staff began to believe something truly dangerous, that Japan was unstoppable. Across the ocean, America was wounded, but not broken. The attack on Pearl Harbor had done what Yamamoto feared most. It awakened the American giant. Factories that once built cars, refrigerators, and sewing machines now roared with a new purpose. Henry Kaiser, an industrial visionary, built shipyards capable of launching vessels faster than any nation in history. Ford's massive Willow Run plant in Michigan was turning out a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. The U.S. wasn't just mobilizing, it was transforming. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had set a near-impossible target. We shall build 60,000 planes this year, and 125,000 next year. People laughed. Even the British doubted it. But within months, America's shipyards began turning out escort carriers, fleet carriers, destroyers, and transport ships by the dozens. By mid-1942, when Japan had just a handful of operational fleet carriers left, the U.S. Navy had already laid the keels for more than 50 new ones. But at first, Japan didn't notice. The Imperial Navy's intelligence service tracked major ship movements, but America's industrial output, hidden behind secure ports and inland factories, remained invisible. Japanese commanders, still victorious in early 1942, believed their advantage would last indefinitely. They saw American carriers as isolated prey, targets to be lured and destroyed. When Yamamoto planned the Battle of Midway, he was confident it would end the carrier threat once and for all. His scouts had identified only 3 U.S. carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, all battered and undermanned. Destroy them, he thought, and the Pacific would be Japan's forever. He didn't know it yet. But his fleet was sailing toward the most decisive disaster in Japanese naval history. At Midway, everything changed. American cryptographers had cracked Japan's naval codes, allowing Admiral Chester Nimitz to anticipate every move. When the Japanese fleet struck Midway Island, U.S. carriers were already lying in wait. And in a matter of hours, Japan's illusion of invincibility shattered. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, went up in flames. They took with them hundreds of Japan's best pilots and deck crews, the very heart of the Kido Butai. Yamamoto's empire of the sea had been dealt a blow it could never fully recover from. But Japan didn't realize the full scale of what was coming next. They still believed that the United States, even with its industrial power, couldn't possibly replace ships that took years to build. They couldn't imagine what American shipyards were about to unleash. Because while Japan mourned the loss of 4 carriers, America was building 8 more. And that was only the beginning. By late 1942, Japan had only 6 operational carriers left. But they didn't know that by the following year, the United States would field over 50 carriers, both fleet and escort types, across the Pacific. From the Atlantic coast to the California docks, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, entire cities were working around the clock to produce the unthinkable. One American shipyard worker said, "We didn't have time to think. We just built. We built until the war was won." While Japan clung to its dwindling elite force, America was training thousands of new pilots every month. While Japan crafted each ship carefully by hand, the U.S. was turning out carriers like assembly line machines. And soon, those machines would swarm across the Pacific like a metallic tide. Japan's admirals had no idea what was about to hit them. In 1941, Japan had the greatest carrier fleet on Earth. By 1944, America had more aircraft carriers than the rest of the world combined. And for Japan's commanders, the realization would come too late, when the sky above the Pacific turned dark with American planes, because the age of Japanese dominance was over. The shock of Pearl Harbor had left the United States staggering, but not defeated. In the smoldering remains of battleships and airfields, something began to stir. Determination. When the Japanese attack destroyed America's Pacific Fleet, Tokyo believed it had crippled U.S. naval power for years. But what they didn't understand was how fast the American war machine could move once unleashed. President Roosevelt called it the arsenal of democracy. And soon, that arsenal would flood the oceans. In Washington, the Navy scrambled to rebuild. Admiral Ernest King, known for his iron will, ordered a total transformation of America's shipbuilding priorities. Every available dock, yard, and machine was turned toward one goal: outbuild the enemy. At Newport News, Norfolk, and Puget Sound, blueprints for new aircraft carriers were drawn and redrawn overnight. But the real secret wasn't just design, it was mass production. Factories that had once produced cars now churned out airplane engines. Ford's assembly lines produced B-24 bombers like Model Ts. And in California, Henry Kaiser, the man who had revolutionized shipbuilding, turned his attention to war. Kaiser's yards could build a Liberty ship in under 5 days. If ships that large could be built that fast, he argued, imagine what could be done with smaller, faster warships. So began the mass production of escort carriers, compact ships built to protect convoys and support amphibious assaults. They weren't as large or powerful as fleet carriers like Enterprise or Saratoga, but they could be built 10 times faster. By early 1943, the U.S. had launched so many escort carriers that Japanese submarines struggled even to count them. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy's High Command watched these developments with curiosity and skepticism. They believed America could never match Japan's craftsmanship or naval tradition. Their shipbuilders were masters of precision, each vessel a work of art. The Japanese admirals took pride in their carrier designs, ships like Shokaku and Zuikaku, fast, elegant, deadly. Each was built with care, discipline, and an almost spiritual dedication to detail. But there was a fatal flaw in that thinking. While Japan built for perfection, America built for quantity. And in total war, quantity had a power all its own. Still, Japan was confident. By mid-1942, they controlled most of the Pacific. Their naval air forces had won at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the Coral Sea. They believed that with proper tactics, they could destroy any American fleet, no matter how large. But behind the smoke of war, American shipyards were turning out carriers faster than Japan's intelligence networks could report. In April 1942, Japan still had the edge, 10 fleet carriers to America's 5. By 1943, that ratio would flip. And by 1944, the difference would be catastrophic. In 1943, a new beast arrived, the Essex-class carrier. It was larger, faster, and tougher than anything that had come before it. Capable of launching over 90 aircraft, the Essex could sustain entire air campaigns without returning to port. It had thicker armor, improved elevators, and advanced radar that gave its crews an edge in both day and night operations. When the first of these giants, USS Essex, was commissioned in December 1942, it marked the start of a tidal wave. Over the next 2 years, the U.S. would produce 24 Essex-class carriers, each one representing a floating city of American firepower. And while Japan struggled to replace even one lost carrier, America was completing a new one every 2 weeks. That pace seemed unreal to Japanese planners. They thought it was impossible. When Japan launched the carrier Taiho in 1944, their most advanced warship, American shipyards had already launched 7 more carriers of the Essex class. It wasn't just speed, it was scale. Each Essex carrier was accompanied by destroyers, cruisers, submarines, and supply ships, forming massive task forces that could operate independently across thousands of miles of ocean. For Japan, that was unthinkable. Their carriers had always operated in carefully coordinated groups, the Kido Butai. But America now had multiple Kido Butai, spread across the Pacific like a swarm. Behind every ship, every plane, every gun, stood the might of American industry. From the inland steel mills of Pittsburgh to the aircraft factories of San Diego, the entire nation was part of the production chain. Women entered the workforce in record numbers: riveters, welders, draftsmen, engineers. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of strength. One worker later recalled, "We didn't know how to build a carrier, but we learned fast. Every day we built faster, stronger, better." By the end of 1943, America wasn't just replacing its fleet. It was building a navy twice as large as before the war began. At its peak, a new American ship was launched every single day. The Japanese had no answer to that. Their own shipyards were under constant bombing, their resources dwindling, their fuel supplies critical. While Japanese ships took years to construct, American ones rolled off the docks like clockwork. It was no longer a question of skill. It was a question of momentum. By late 1943, Japanese reconnaissance flights began reporting strange things. New American carriers, dozens of them, moving across the Pacific. New airfields appearing on once deserted islands. An endless convoy of supply ships stretching from Hawaii to Australia. At first, Japanese commanders thought their pilots were exaggerating, but soon, reports poured in from the Solomons, from the Marshalls, from the Gilberts. Everywhere they looked, American carriers. When Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, saw intelligence estimates of America's carrier numbers, he was stunned. He reportedly muttered, "Impossible. There can't be that many," but there were, and they were heading straight for the Central Pacific. The Empire of Japan had awakened a force it could no longer control, and the men who once believed the Pacific belonged to them were about to learn the true meaning of American industrial power. Japan had started the war with 6 proud carriers. By 1944, the United States had more than 100. And for the Japanese commanders who once ruled the seas, that realization would hit harder than any torpedo. Because no amount of courage, discipline, or strategy could stop a fleet that seemed to multiply overnight. The Pacific Ocean was no longer their empire. It had become America's factory floor. By early 1944, something had changed in the Pacific. The once invincible Imperial Japanese Navy was beginning to sense that the ocean no longer belonged to them. Their reconnaissance planes spotted vast carrier groups, not one, not two, but entire fleets of American carriers, each one packed with fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes. To the Japanese, it was a nightmare unfolding in real time. They had expected to face maybe 3 or 4 American carriers after Pearl Harbor, but what they saw now looked like an armada. Admiral Minichi Koga, who had succeeded Yamamoto as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, stared in disbelief at the reports. He said quietly, "They build them as we breathe air." The turning point came in November 1943, during the invasion of the Gilbert Islands, the Battle of Tarawa. For the first time, America's new carrier strategy was unleashed in full. Multiple carrier task forces coordinated across hundreds of miles, launching wave after wave of airstrikes with deadly precision. From the decks of the USS Essex, Bunker Hill, and Yorktown, thousands of aircraft took off to hammer Japanese airfields and coastal defenses. Observers on Tarawa recalled the sky turning black with American planes. In just 3 days, Japan lost over 120 aircraft and several key ships, while the Americans lost barely a handful. The Japanese Naval Command couldn't comprehend how the Americans could replace their losses so quickly. In Tokyo, one stunned analyst wrote in his report, "The Americans seem to possess unlimited carriers. We destroy one, and 2 more appear." And that was no exaggeration, because behind every fleet at sea, there were more waiting at Pearl Harbor, San Diego, and Seattle, being painted, armed, and manned as they spoke. By the spring of 1944, the U.S. Navy A.S. Fast Carrier Task Force, Task Force 58, had become the most powerful naval formation in history. Under the command of Admiral Mark Mitcher and overseen by Admiral Raymond Spruance, this floating air force was made up of 15 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, over 900 aircraft, and a screening force of hundreds of destroyers, cruisers, and battleships. Every carrier group was self-sufficient. It could launch, strike, and recover aircraft without outside support. Fuel, ammunition, and even fresh food were delivered by vast supply convoys at sea, a concept Japan had never mastered. The U.S. Navy had turned the Pacific Ocean into a mobile battlefield. Its ships no longer needed bases. The fleet was the base. This level of coordination stunned even Allied observers. British Admiral Andrew Cunningham once remarked, "The Americans have created an empire of steel that floats." But the Japanese weren't ready to surrender the seas just yet. In June 1944, they gathered their remaining carriers for a desperate counterattack, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japan committed 9 carriers and over 400 aircraft. Their pilots were brave, but many were young, poorly trained, and inexperienced. Opposing them were 15 American carriers, more than 900 aircraft, and radar systems that could detect incoming raids long before they arrived. On June 19th, the Japanese launched their massive strike, hundreds of planes roaring toward the American fleet. But the Americans were ready. Radar picked them up over 100 miles out. As the Japanese squadrons approached, the American Combat Air Patrol, led by Hellcat fighters, tore into them. The result was devastating. In a single day, Japan lost over 300 aircraft and nearly all its trained carrier pilots. So many were shot down that American aviators nicknamed the battle the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By the time the day ended, Japan's carrier force was crippled. 3 carriers were sunk, and the rest limped home. Meanwhile, America barely lost a fraction of its planes, and by the next morning, replacements were already on the way from newly arrived ships. For Japan, the realization was crushing. They had thrown everything they had into that battle, and it had vanished in smoke and flame. Back in Tokyo, the Imperial Navy's intelligence officers pored over intercepted radio signals and reconnaissance data. Each new report only deepened the sense of disbelief. America had lost carriers at Coral Sea, Midway, and Santa Cruz, and yet the number of active U.S. carriers seemed to be increasing. They began to compile a list of known hull numbers and ship names: Essex, Intrepid, Lexington, Wasp, Bunker Hill, Hornet, Ticonderoga. But no matter how many they identified, new ones kept appearing. Admiral Somu Toyota, who took command after Koga's death, finally snapped during a briefing. Slamming his hand on the table, he shouted, "How many do they have?" No one could answer. American production had reached such a scale that Japanese intelligence estimates were constantly outdated. For every ship Japan thought destroyed, another took its place within weeks. It was as if the United States had endless shipyards hidden beneath the waves. For the Japanese commanders, the shock wasn't just strategic, it was psychological. They had entered the war believing in the spiritual superiority of the Japanese warrior. They believed discipline and bravery could overcome material advantage. But how do you fight an enemy that builds faster than you can sink? How do you face a fleet that grows larger every month, while yours disappears? By the end of 1944, Japan's carrier fleet was a shadow of its former self. Most of its surviving ships had no aircraft left to launch. Fuel shortages grounded the planes that remained. Meanwhile, American carriers swarmed the Pacific, striking from the Marianas to the Philippines, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa. Each attack brought more ships, more aircraft, more power. One Japanese officer wrote in his diary, "They rise from the sea like ghosts. When one falls, another takes its place. We fight the ocean itself." The Imperial Navy's proud carriers, the heart of the Pearl Harbor strike force, were gone. And yet, the Americans were just getting started. Japan had built an empire on 6 carriers. America now had over 100 and more under construction. It was no longer a contest of fleets. It was a contest of nations. And only one nation had the industrial heartbeat to win. The Pacific would soon witness the full fury of that machine. By late 1944, the Pacific Ocean had become an American factory floor. Where Japan once ruled the waves, now floated endless gray hulls, aircraft carriers, destroyers, cruisers, and supply ships, each one built in record time. And somewhere in the middle of that vast oceanic empire, the Imperial Japanese Navy was dying. In Tokyo, the once proud naval staff held their breath as the war reports arrived. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had destroyed Japan's elite pilots. The subsequent Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought just months later, would destroy their ships. It was the largest naval battle in human history, over 300 ships clashing across the Philippine archipelago. Japan threw everything it had, its last battleships, its last carriers, even suicide tactics, in a desperate attempt to halt the American advance. The Americans came with something else: sheer numbers. Admiral William Bull Halsey's carrier groups stretched across the horizon, their decks packed with F-6F Hellcats and SB-2C Helldivers. Each strike wave darkened the skies. Each attack tore apart what was left of Japan's navy. In a desperate gamble, the Japanese used what little they had left: empty aircraft carriers. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa sent them north, a decoy meant to lure Halsey AS carriers away from the real battle. They carried almost no aircraft. Their flight decks were nearly silent. The plan was simple: trick the Americans into chasing ghosts. For a moment it worked. Halsey, always aggressive, took the bait and raced north with his powerful carrier fleet. But even this trap revealed Japan's fatal weakness. Their own carriers had no planes left to fight. They were symbols of a navy that had lost its purpose. When U.S. aircraft finally found them, the results were inevitable. In a matter of hours, 4 Japanese carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, were reduced to flaming wrecks. As the last one sank beneath the waves, American pilots circled overhead, astonished by how little resistance they faced. Below them, the Imperial Navy, once the terror of Pearl Harbor, vanished in smoke and oil. While Japanese shipyards struggled to repair a single destroyer, America was building entire fleets. At the Kaiser shipyards in California, welders worked around the clock under floodlights. A new Essex-class carrier could be completed in just 14 months. Light carriers took even less time. By the end of 1944, the United States Navy operated 16 fleet carriers, 9 light carriers, over 70 escort carriers, each capable of launching aircraft for patrols and convoys. The sheer scale was unimaginable. Japanese engineers studying captured documents could hardly believe it. They calculated that to match America's pace, Japan would need over 10 times its existing industrial capacity. Admiral Toyota remarked bitterly, "We cannot outbuild a nation that constructs airfields faster than we can find them." And it wasn't just the ships. For every American carrier came an army of supply vessels, oil tankers, repair ships, and floating docks. The Pacific had turned into a living assembly line, one that moved by early 1945. The Pacific belonged to the United States. Every major island chain, the Marshalls, the Marianas, the Philippines, had fallen. From these captured islands, American air bases extended their reach even further. Now the carriers didn't have to operate alone. They worked alongside land-based bombers, P-51 Mustangs, and B-29 Superfortresses. For Japan, there was nowhere left to hide. In March 1945, Task Force 58 sailed toward Japan itself. Its orders: destroy what remained of Japanese industry and cripple any fleet that dared leave port. Tokyo, Kura, Yokosuka, names that had once struck fear into America's heart, were now targets on U.S. maps. Thousands of carrier-based planes struck shipyards, fuel depots, and airfields. Within weeks, Japan's naval bases were smoking ruins. The once proud imperial fleet no longer existed. By mid-1945, Japanese admirals could only watch helplessly as their fleet rusted in shallow harbors. Some ships had no fuel, others had no ammunition. Many had no crews left. Their sailors were either dead, captured, or reassigned to fight on land. One Japanese officer described the scene in his journal. The carriers are empty shells. Their decks are silent. The Americans have hundreds. We have ghosts. The last surviving carrier, the Zuikaku, had been part of the original Pearl Harbor strike. Now, at Leyte Gulf, she was gone. The circle of war had closed. Meanwhile, in the United States, new carriers continued to roll off the production lines: Bennington, Shangri-La, Lake Champlain. Even as Japan fought for its survival, America was already preparing for the next phase of the war, the invasion of Japan itself. But that invasion would never come the way anyone expected. The Battle of Leyte Gulf and the destruction of Japan's carrier fleet marked the end of Japanese naval dominance and the dawn of America's global power. From 1941 to 1945, the U.S. had not just defeated Japan at sea, it had reinvented naval warfare. The carrier was now the undisputed king of battle, and America had more kings than any empire in history. Japanese admirals, once confident that the Pacific was their empire's lifeline, now faced a horrifying truth. The ocean that had given them power was the same one that delivered their defeat. Admiral Toyota wrote in his final report, "The enemy does not fight with men, but with machines. Their sea is infinite. Their carriers are endless." He wasn't exaggerating. By the time Japan surrendered, America had built 122 aircraft carriers of all classes. Japan had built just 25, most of which lay at the bottom of the ocean. The tide of war had turned, not by chance, but by industry, innovation, and relentless will. But even as the last Japanese ship sank, something remarkable was taking shape, a decision that would change naval warfare forever. The U.S. Navy wasn't just building carriers to win the war, it was building a new world order, one where the seas would never again be ruled by any empire but theirs. And soon that empire would bring the war to Japan's doorstep. It was the spring of 1945. Japan's empire had been cut to pieces, its supply lines strangled, its navy annihilated. But in Tokyo, the admirals refused to accept what their eyes could already see. They had always believed in the strength of the battleship. They had worshipped the might of steel hulls and massive guns. Yet now, the sky ruled the sea. And America's aircraft carriers, dozens of them, patrolled the Pacific like floating fortresses. In April 1945, Japan made one last, desperate move. They called it Operation Tengo. The mission was pure suicide. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, a floating mountain of armor and artillery, was ordered to sail toward Okinawa. Her mission: beach herself and become an unsinkable gun platform, firing until destroyed. She would have no air cover, no chance of return. Even her crew knew the truth. As one sailor reportedly wrote in his diary, "We go not to victory, but to our deaths." When American intelligence intercepted the plan, the response was immediate. From the decks of their carriers, waves of Helldivers, Avengers, and Corsairs roared into the sky. On April 7, 1945, the Yamato was sighted by American reconnaissance aircraft in the East China Sea. Minutes later, the attack began. Over 380 American planes descended upon a single ship. Bombs ripped through the decks, torpedoes smashed into her hull, and fires consumed the interior. Despite her monstrous armor, the Yamato could not survive. At 2:23 p.m., a final explosion tore through her magazine. The mighty battleship, pride of the Imperial Navy, broke apart and vanished beneath the sea, taking 3,000 men with her. Watching from above, American pilots couldn't believe what they were seeing. One radioed in disbelief, the biggest ship in the world, gone in minutes. Back in Tokyo, the reaction was one of stunned silence. Admiral Soemu Toyota received the report in his underground command bunker. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, he whispered, "We built a god of steel. But the Americans built an army of skies." That moment captured everything Japan's naval leadership had refused to admit for years, that America's carriers had rewritten the laws of naval warfare. The Japanese Navy had entered the war believing in quality over quantity. One ship, one sword, one strike. America fought with a completely different philosophy: mass production, coordination, and constant replacement. When one carrier was damaged, another took its place. When one plane was lost, 5 more were waiting. When a pilot fell, there were 10 more trained to fly the next day. This wasn't just strategy. It was industrial warfare, something Japan could never hope to match. By mid-1945, the Pacific Ocean was a sea of steel. Nearly 100 American warships crisscrossed it, supported by dozens of carriers. Entire islands had been turned into supply hubs. Guam, Saipan, Ulithi, these were no longer just outposts. They were floating cities feeding an unstoppable war machine. Everywhere Japanese lookouts turned their binoculars, they saw the stars and stripes. In comparison, the once proud Imperial Navy was reduced to rubble. A handful of destroyers, a few cruisers, and the skeletons of carriers lay trapped in their own harbors. The war at sea was over, but Japan's leaders refused to surrender. They still clung to the illusion of divine destiny. And then came the final blow. In July 1945, the U.S. Third Fleet, commanded by Admiral Halsey, sailed directly toward the Japanese homeland. Task Force 38, his carrier arm, launched one of the largest air assaults in history. From the decks of over 15 fleet carriers, thousands of aircraft roared off, striking Japan's last naval bases. Kure, Yokosuka, and Kobe, all were pounded mercilessly. Japanese ships that had survived earlier battles, Haruna, Ise, Hyuga, Amagi, were destroyed in shallow water, unable even to move. American pilots described the eerie sight of ships lying motionless, as if waiting for death. One U.S. aviator recalled, "They didn't even fight back." The anti-aircraft guns were silent. It was like sinking ghosts. For Japan's naval command, it was the final humiliation. Their proud empire had begun the war by destroying American ships at Pearl Harbor, and now they watched helplessly as their own navy was erased from existence. And then, just as Japan tried to regroup on land, the sky opened once more. But this time, it wasn't carrier planes. It was something far more devastating. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. For Japan's remaining admirals, the message was clear. If they could not defeat America at sea or in the air, there was nothing left to fight for. The empire's dreams had died long before the surrender. They had died the moment America's carrier fleets conquered the Pacific. When the surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, the symbolism was perfect. It was signed on the deck of an American battleship, surrounded by American carriers. The same ocean that had once been Japan's weapon was now America's stage. Japanese officers aboard the Missouri looked across the harbor and saw carrier after carrier, each one towering, bristling with aircraft, alive with energy. They had entered the war believing the Pacific belonged to them. They ended it, realizing that it never truly did. America had not only won the war, it had redefined the very concept of naval power. As one Japanese naval officer later said during the occupation, "We believed in the spirit of the warrior. They believed in the power of the machine." The machine won. And in those words lies the entire story of Japan's naval downfall. Their courage was immense, their tactics brilliant, but against a nation that could build 2 carriers before Japan could repair one. Courage was not enough. The Imperial Navy's defeat wasn't just a military loss. It was the end of an era and the beginning of America's undisputed reign over the seas. But what came after would redefine not just Japan's future, but the entire world's balance of power. When the war ended in 1945, the Pacific fell silent for the first time in years. The smoke had cleared. The battleships were gone. The great fleets that once filled the horizon now rested beneath it, silent tombs of steel. Japan was shattered. Its navy, once the pride of the empire, was gone, its shipyards in ruins, its cities turned to ashes. But amid that devastation, something remarkable began to happen. Under American occupation, Japan was forbidden from rebuilding its military power. The Imperial Navy was formally dissolved. Its surviving ships were scrapped or scuttled, and its admirals faced trials or faded into obscurity. But instead of resisting, Japan did something few expected. It adapted. The same shipyards that once built warships began producing cargo vessels, tankers, and eventually, commercial ships that powered a new kind of empire, an economic one. Japanese engineers, once designing torpedoes and aircraft carriers, now turned their brilliance toward cars, electronics, and technology. In just a few decades, the nation that once waged war with steel and fire became a global symbol of peace and innovation. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the United States Navy emerged from World War II as the undisputed ruler of the oceans. By 1945, it operated nearly 100 aircraft carriers, more than every other nation combined. No navy in history had ever controlled such vast power, spread across every ocean on Earth. These floating airfields became the backbone of America's global presence, from the Cold War to the Korean and Vietnam conflicts, to peacekeeping missions across the world. The carrier had proven its supremacy, not just as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of deterrence and diplomacy. Even today, when a U.S. aircraft carrier enters a region, it changes the political equation instantly. And yet, the story doesn't end there. Because in a quiet, ironic twist of history, Japan, the nation that once lost its empire to carrier warfare, would eventually bring the carriers back. In the 21st century, Japan's self-defense forces commissioned advanced warships known as the Izumo class. Officially, they were called helicopter destroyers, but anyone who looked at them could see the truth. Long, flat decks, massive hangars, aircraft elevators. In every way but name, they were carriers, descendants of the very ships that had once brought both glory and ruin to Japan's empire. And now, for the first time since 1945, Japan's new carriers once again host fighter jets, this time American-made F-35s. It's a moment of stunning historical symmetry. The same alliance that once fought to destroy Japan's carriers now stands beside Japan, defending the same ocean together. Imagine, for a moment, one of those old Japanese admirals, men like Isoroku Yamamoto or Suemu Toyoda, standing on a modern Tokyo pier, watching the Izumo glide past. Would they be filled with pride, regret, amazement? They would see a Japan transformed, from a nation driven by conquest, to one dedicated to stability and peace. And perhaps, deep down, they would recognize a truth that eluded them during the war. That true strength is not found in the number of ships you command, but in the resilience of a nation that can rebuild itself from ruin. The lesson of that era still echoes today. America's carriers didn't just win battles. They redefined what power means in the modern world. No longer was dominance about territory or numbers alone. It was about mobility, technology, and the ability to project power anywhere, anytime. From the Battle of Midway to the modern South China Sea, the aircraft carrier remains the ultimate symbol of reach and readiness. And it all began with a war that taught both sides Japan and America, that innovation, not tradition, decides the future. History is filled with irony. The same skies that once brought Japan to its knees now protect it. The same alliance that once clashed in fire now stands shoulder to shoulder. And the vast Pacific, once a battlefield of death, has become a sea of peace, trade, and cooperation. In the end, that might be the most powerful victory of all. The story of Japan's shock at America's aircraft carrier power isn't just a tale of war. It's a story about evolution, resilience, and the dawn of a new world order. If you've made it this far, you've journeyed through one of history's most dramatic transformations. From Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima, from burning battleships to peaceful seas. But there are still countless stories hidden in the waves of World War II. Stories of courage, tragedy, and impossible decisions that shape the modern world. So, if you want to keep uncovering them with us, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and share this video with someone who loves history as much as you do. Because the more we explore the past, the clearer our future becomes.
I'm your host, and this was WW2 Tales. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon. The sea remembers everything.